Hi, lovelies. Lisa here from Mindful Tarot, and I'm wanting to film before the light completely fades. I wanted to film a wrap-up video for the challenge I just hosted in June on Instagram, the Little Storm Challenge. And the name of the challenge comes from Eden Gallanter's Cheimonette Tarot deck. The word Cheimonette is kind of hobbled together from Greek and from French, and it literally means little storm. Now, as I understand it, the little storm at issue here is the little storm, the chaos of creativity as this deck explores it. And that creativity is really, I think, why it's linked to chaos is because of the ways in which chaos and even chaos theory in a kind of sense of physics shows a world that is profoundly interconnected and united. You know, the classic idea of chaos is that a butterfly um, wiggles its wings over in China and weather patterns are changed over in, California, like that horrible Ashton Kutcher film. Well, it depends if you love Ashton. You might like the film. No offense. The butterfly effect, right? These small increments of change create these global effects because everything is interconnected. So patterns that seem random, that seem hodgepodgey, really, if our perspective widens, the pieces fit together. So this chaos of our world is chaos because we're looking at it through this narrow lens, right? And as our heart and mind and soul and being kind of adopts more expansive view, things fall into place. And that is, I think, one of the core experiences of creativity, where things fall into place, where transformations happen, not necessarily because we're creating something completely new, but there's a way in which there's a shift, a revolution of perspective, sort of a hanged man, um, a hanged man shift of our perspective on the world, right? That allows us, even though we might be shackled and tied and unable to fly, this hanged man has these kind of vestigial wings that haven't yet sprouted into full-on angel wings, but nonetheless, that shift in perspective is the kind of core of the creative process, maybe from one perspective. So creativity then has a lot to do with finding the wholeness that might not be visible because our identification with the self is too tight, too small. And in that sense, creativity has everything to do with the relationship between the self and the world that it finds meaning within, and how at odds or how um, separate self and world are. So that relationship between self and world is in fact captured in the three cards in Eden Gallanter's deck. And I should say right now that I think this video, I mean, I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to talk about, but in some ways this is a deck review and also a kind of wrap-up of my own learnings from this month of intensive work with the deck. So maybe you'll enjoy watching it, maybe you won't. Stick around, I hope. Anyway, at some point the light is going to fade so much, so I'll just have to stop talking. So there you go. Anyway, the three cards of the world in this deck. Eden Gallanter starts with something that's, I mean, it's unusual, but it's fundamentally the world card, kind of as we know it, with this really objective anthropomorphic figure. There are these snakes, which is interesting, and the way that this deck uses sigils, uses sort of animal totems. I mean, she calls them sigils. So this sort of magical force of these beings are attached to different things, different suits. So the sigil of swords is the moth, which also has this meaning of death for her. The sigil for discs is the horse, which for her, for Eden, has everything to do with desire and will and determination. The sigil for cups is the fish, so that sense of water and depth, and being submerged. The sigil for wands is, in some ways, it's these weird, I'm trying to remember what it really is. All throughout that deck, or that suit, are these, the wands are themselves these roots, but I'm wondering if the snake is actually the sigil for staves in this deck, and I can't recall, come to think of it. It's the one sigil that doesn't really leap out for me. I may pause this and try to, and just look that up because it's bothering me. Be right back. Yes, the sigil is the serpent, and it, as I'm recalling now, it does appear quite prominently in the ace of the suit, and very much the serpent in the sense of this image of change, and I think this sort of image for me, I mean, the serpent also, interestingly, and the world card really emphasizes this, kind of has this Ouroboros connotation to it. So it's the change of shedding your skin and transforming, very much relates to the suit of staves and the fiery energy, that kind of determined, willful wands energy. But then that change, you know, the Ouroboros reminds us that what goes around comes around. So change, from one perspective, what looks like linear transformation, from another perspective, is just another turn of the wheel. That theme of a kind of creative transformation of the world, which isn't really transformation, like nothing is new, but there's a revolution in perspective, that seems an insight that is all through this deck. But anyway, going back to the world card, so you know, it starts with this very anthropomorphic vision of the world, and the world, you know, as the whole, as completion, as everything, right? The question is, you know, as the culminating trump, the sort of end of the fool's journey, is this culmination something we achieve, something we are, something we reach? So, you know, in a sense, from the way in which the world card is established, it starts with the sense of the world as a kind of objective reality, the sort of objective sense of through this anthropomorphic being, and then becomes more and more abstract. So this is the second, the second in the series. And you see that kind of rift in the middle that is a, okay, the abort, drop frames. I don't know why my computer keeps doing that. So hopefully this, I'm picking right up where I left off, and nothing really got lost. So the second card gets more abstract. The third card, we just have this opening, and we have the circularity of the world. Now these twin serpents eating each other's tails, intertwined. Holding it upside down, I'm sorry. What I think already in the movement from a kind of quasi-traditional, you know, the world is this objective thing out there, to something a little bit more abstract, to this sense almost of an eye, of an opening, of a hole, that the WHOLE is kind of expressed as an HOLE, you know, that there's this kind of emptiness at the heart of this completion. That seems really significant and important for this deck. I'm realizing that my light is fading here. For some reason, the clouds cleared. We got a little bit more light. Okay, all right, I'll keep talking. I hear you, heavens. I'll keep talking. The light has come. Let there be light. Okay, so I think my main point here is that this is a deck that is asking us to explore creativity in terms of the relationship between self and world, and is asking us to see the creative process as an opening up of boundaries, or a widening of perspective that questions the ways in which we might see the self as at odds with the world. that it's not me trying to transform a world out there. It's just transformation. It's just expansion. It's all world, right? There's a lot to say here. One of the things that's really distinctive, I think this is a deck that does a huge amount of work. Perhaps the most interesting work is happening in the pips, in the suits. The trumps are wonderful and interesting, but actually that's not what held my attention throughout this challenge. It wasn't so much what the action of the trumps, although there are a couple of themes I want to stress about the trumps, but it was much more really the ways in which the suits kind of enact some wacky stuff. Now, it's tempting because Eden's imagery doesn't map neatly onto Rider-Waite symbolism to think that this is more of a Marseille deck or maybe a Thoth-inspired deck. Thoth, or I don't, all right, I'm not even going to, Thoth, I think that's how Elle at Sacred Seed explained to pronounce that name. So Thoth, Thoth, that deck. It may be tempting to see this the Cheimonette Tarot as less Rider-Waite Smith. Eden herself talks about influences from all of those, but I actually think this is fundamentally a Rider-Waite Smith deck, but one with a very, very, very strong point of view. I found this deck tremendously powerful to read from. I found that it is a deck that you can read really intuitively, but I did really want to use the little white book. So my starting point with the cards really was in the very detailed, very rich readings that Eden herself provides. She encourages us in the little white book to make educated guesses. She's like, just dive in. But I think that and she herself acknowledges that she doesn't know what all the symbolism of her imagery means, that she was working intuitively. She was working from the standpoint of that creative little storm, that chaotic holism of a vision that's really big, feels kind of confusing, a little murky because our perspective tends to be narrow. So she didn't always know, she says, what her images meant entirely, and encourages us to dive in. That said, I think her words are a great starting point. So, even something as un-Rider-Waite Smithy, let me find something here that I want to look at the Four of Discs if I can find it quickly. Four of Discs. Here we go. So, this is her Four of Discs. So how is that anything like the kind of withholding of resources, or the kind of connotation of the miser, or that stewarding, that kind of tightness of the traditional Rider-Waite Smith Four of Pentacles? I mean, it is an image of the the Princess of Discs. The imagery that appears in each of the suits, the human figures are always drawn from the court of that suit. So, so here we have the Princess of Discs, and she's a tree, and we see that she is kind of leaking from every possible place she can leak. She's leaking from her sex, from her breasts, from her eyes. There's this kind of emblem of her womb that has a kind of like, you can sort of see what looks like it might be a sperm, and this kind of abstract picture that I interpret, it's sort of like a cross, but it's also like the fallopian tubes in the womb. So one of the things she talks about in her little white book is the way in which this suit, this card, we have in this one figure the entire whole cycle of reproduction, that she's got it all together. It's all encapsulated, just like in a tree you have, branch, flower, fruit, root. You've got the whole kind of reproductive system, I guess, in some sense. It's all together. So, for her, the discs, that suit seems to be very much dealing with the way in which self reaches toward culmination through the body, through things like sex and natural reproduction, that we move toward our future, trying to recreate ourselves in our world, and literally doing so through having babies, for instance. So, here the Four of Discs becomes an image of a kind of, folding back that reproductive process completely on the self. So, like, I can do it all my own. I've got it all together. I've got sperm, I've got seed, I've got, it's all like all in me, right? So, it's a powerful image. It is an image of withholding or trying to contain it all, the self trying to hold on to the future, to the kind of trajectory of being human, of living, giving birth, dying, all of that being kind of collapsed into one individual, which is a kind of not very tenable place to be. I mean, we can't hold on to it all ourselves. And that is a message that this deck says over and over and over again in different ways, that creativity requires letting go of the self and of narrow boundaries of self. So that kind of miserly energy traditionally associated with the Four of Discs, here expressed in terms of the way we might try to hold on to the fullness of our biological reproductive selves. And then when that becomes the Five of Discs, so, the sort of poverty, impoverishment thing, here we have the couple of, I'm thinking it's the Princess and the Prince of Discs, but again, the Princess again, and they're together. But how does that togetherness become impoverishing rather than enriching? So if this is her trying to hold on to everything about sort of the human process of reproduction of self, in the next card we see what happens after, mating occurs and the relationship becomes stagnant. So it's an image of stagnation that you can kind of see how it relates to the poverty mindedness of the Five of Discs as a kind of, miserliness toward poverty. So withholding, moving toward this kind of dead relationship. And you see the skulls there. The couple is tied together, but this is stagnant and dying. So it feels to me like an interpretation, no doubt influenced by number seems important to her. So numerical sequence seems important to her in a way that kind of recalls Marseille kind of thinking. I think there are ways in which Thoth symbolism is probably also at play. I don't know that deck well enough to be able to speak to that, but definitely I can read the Rider-Waite energy here as interpreted through the themes that Eden seems to take to heart. Another example of this, which is really quite striking, and she talks about it in the book, in her little book, is the Eight of Staves. So the Eight of Wands, this is like that that speed message, project reaching completion energy of the Eight of Wands. Whoa, how does this card denote that? What she says in her little white book is that this kind of constraint that can happen in the process of creating, where we feel bound and tied, leads toward completion. That sometimes being compressed helps us create more. Let me read her words because she's more eloquent than I am. She says, "The Prince of Staves hangs suspended, bound tightly in a frame made out of the 8 staves. It is the same position the Fool took in the Hanged Man, right, but right side up." That's another thing that happens throughout this deck, this repetition of figures. So I mentioned it with the court figures being the human figures throughout the suits, but then also this repetition of the figure of the Fool. So the Fool's journey is played out in the repetition of the Fool throughout the trumps, but also even in the suits. So she uses repetition throughout the deck in a way that's quite remarkable. The prince is not voluntarily strung up as the Hanged Man was, and his female sex parts only serve to enhance his vulnerability. So, he is vulnerable here. But he smiles as though he is happy with his fetters. The explanation is that he cannot be harmed or violated. His head is free. and he has utter faith in the power of his mind. It is worth mentioning that this card is normally associated with quick action, and the image may seem in direct conflict with that concept. But quickness and agility belong to the creative imagination, which is merely thrown into relief when it is constrained. The fire always burns its way out, and the sheer power of a person with both wisdom and the creative application of his mind will make him truly unafraid and invulnerable. So she's explicitly saying, yeah, no, this doesn't look at all like the Eight of Wands that you're used to, but the kind of constraint that we're seeing here is the constraint that happens as part of the creative imagination, and that is what makes the quickness of action and movement toward completion possible. This is very complex stuff. I'm not saying that this is a straightforward, that either these images are straightforward or even her own explanation is straightforward. But what remains, I think, fairly clear, even in the complexity of this deck, is the way in which, again and again, she's asking us to envision the ways in which what we see as border and boundary and constraint actually is freedom if we just allow our perspective to widen and expand. And in each of the suits, again, I think the suits here are in some ways more interesting than the trump cards in this deck, although I love the trump cards. But in each of the suits, she battles with or expresses that relationship between self and world, between a kind of sense of I'm me and here's everything and I feel constrained and how do I break out of it? How do I express myself? Between that kind of viewpoint and this broader expanse, right? And the possibility of opening into that broad expanse. She explores that tension in different ways. So with the swords, the suit of the intellect, where the sigil is the moth, which she associates with death. I'm just looking for her death card because, and I might not be able to find it quickly. Oh yeah, here's the death card. So the death is pregnant wearing a mask, and she's kind of holding as her child of a version of the Fool. I believe that's the Fool. It doesn't look at all like the Fool as initially described, but see, she's got these wings, and it's the moth. And the moth, again, like the snake, is sort of an image of transformation, but also she likes the way in which moths have these false eyes on them, the sort of camouflage. You see the eyes at the edge there. This camouflage, that natural camouflage where it looks like an eye and it helps keep predators away. So she says, death appears here as a woman pregnant. Oh, she appears with the priest as a choir boy. Okay, so it's not... Boy, I would not have gotten that. Okay, I had forgotten that. So that little boy is the priest. There's a complicated reading here for her of the relationship between the priest and death. That's really interesting. Maybe I'll do a second video and talk a little bit more about the trumps in this deck. A video when there's still light. I'm watching the moon is rising. Maybe someday I'll have lights and an actual camera, and wouldn't that be lovely? Okay. Just quickly now to finish this little nubbin of thought. So, in swords, the tension between self and world and this creative need to expand has to do with the way in which our mind can appreciate a world that's bigger than self. Like I can, through my prefrontal cortex, I can make decisions that delay gratification. This is this cool thing about humans. We have the newest part of the mammal brain, the prefrontal cortex, which can say, "Oh no, not for me, thanks. I'm watching my weight." We can forego immediate gratification because we can think past the boundaries of this moment. And taken to the extreme, we can think up stuff that is completely beyond this mortal body. In fact, we can identify through ideas, through the mind, with a world that exists beyond the needs of the body. So we can think beyond our own death. That's why death and the moth are the sigil for the sword. So, when she's looking at swords, this is an image that haunts me. Her Seven of Swords, the theft card, this moth, butterfly moth, is feeding off of the blood from this tree. It's a very chilling image for me. It's an image that's about the way in which life consumes life. which is an idea that to wrap my mind around. I mean, it's not fair if you're the tree. It's icky if you're the moth, this is a reason why, I was a vegetarian for many years. It's like I don't want to feed off of sentient beings. But life, the reality is life consumes life. And my ability to understand that and grapple with that, that's something that to really soak that up, that's bigger than me. Um, my biological being uh, commits me to um, a world that, at the level of self, isn't really fair. I mean, eat or be eaten. This isn't about fair. So my mind is bigger than my biological being. On another level, one of the things that the suit of the swords is always doing in Eden's deck is showing us how we can take these great leaps, um, at the risk of an entire world falling apart. So there's this real destructive force. Our minds are bigger than our biological being, which means that we can make decisions that endanger life, the kind of decisions that throw a planet into climate crisis. So each of the suits deals with this tension between self and world, and the way in which my vision, my understanding needs to expand beyond the limits of myself in different ways. I've just talked about swords tonight. My light is going, so I'm going to stop now. I might do a second video and talk a little bit more about the other suits and the trumps, and talk a little bit about what I discovered. But this is all for tonight, and I haven't had a chance yet to really fully respond to all of the fabulous postings on Instagram. It was such a wonderful and rich experience for me. The first challenge I hosted, and the first challenge I've actually done. So so much love to all of you. Mwah. This community is so rich and so delicious. And big cyber hugs. Hug. Okay. Good night, everyone.